Apollonius of Tyre was a Stoic philosopher. There's not much known about the life of Apollonius, but we know that he was born in Athens in the 1st century CE. His father was Greek and his mother was Jewish. He studied rhetoric and philosophy in Athens, and then he traveled around the Mediterranean, teaching philosophy. He eventually settled in Rome, where he became a citizen. Stoicism was a philosophy that taught people how to be calm and still in the face of danger. In this letter, Pliny describes how he went to Apollonius in Rome for help with a personal problem. Pliny was having trouble in his marriage, and so he went to Apollonius for advice. They were off the coast of an island called Kos when a storm came out of nowhere. Pliny was terrified, but Apollonius was calm and collected. He told Pliny to look at the waves and to appreciate the power of the sea. Hadrian was only 14 years old when he met Apollonius, but he was already interested in philosophy. Apollonius tutored him for several years, and he taught him the principles of Stoicism. He persecuted Christians, he started pointless wars, and he wasted vast sums of money on pleasure. Apollonius was right. Hadrian was no better than a slave to his own desires. Hadrian was a quick learner, and he soon became one of the leading Stoics in Rome. Antoninus was a good and pious man, and he brought stability to the empire. It didn't matter if you were born a slave or a king, if you lived a good and virtuous life, you could achieve happiness and fulfillment. Apuleius was a brilliant writer and thinker, and he became one of the most important figures in Antoninus's court. He uses vivid imagery and dramatic storytelling to explore complex philosophical themes. In fact, The Golden Ass is considered to be the first novel ever written in Latin. He served as the governor of several provinces in the Roman Empire, and he was even appointed to the prestigious office of Praetorian Prefect. But even though he was successful in the eyes of the world, he never forgot his roots. He remained a champion of the poor and the oppressed, and he never stopped fighting for justice and equality. It was also incredibly influential on later writers, including Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Cervantes. For example, in The Golden Ass, he uses the metaphor of the donkey to explore the nature of identity. The protagonist is a human being who is trapped in the body of an animal, and he struggles to maintain his dignity and his humanity. Apuleius was a Christian, but he didn't let that stop him from serving the emperor. But these men were not very helpful to the average person. Their ideas were too abstract and their teachings were too complicated. Apollonius was different. He was a philosopher who cared about the average person. He wanted to help them solve their problems and make their lives better. He knew that the best way to serve Antoninus was to use his intellect and his writing skills. He also continued the tradition of Stoic philosophy. He studied the works of Seneca and Epictetus, and he appointed former slaves to influential positions. Apollonius was a great philosopher, but he was also a great humanitarian. He understood the importance of giving back and he dedicated his life to helping those in need. And this experience had a profound impact on Pliny. He realized that he had been living his life in fear, and he resolved to change. The surprising thing is that Apollonius didn't try to give him philosophical advice. He described how he had been a slave for many years, but then he had been freed by a kind woman named Faustina. After he was free, he studied rhetoric and philosophy, and then he became a tutor to the future emperor. Apuleius didn't think that being a slave was shameful. He said that slavery was an accident of birth, and he believed that everyone could achieve greatness if they were given the opportunity. He said that Antoninus had given him a chance to prove himself, and he had repaid that trust by becoming one of his most trusted advisors. He showed his students how to live a good and virtuous life. He traveled around the Mediterranean, and he also wrote books. He wrote about every subject imaginable, including ethics, politics, religion, and literature. But his most famous work is a book called The Golden Ass. It's a novel about a man who is turned into a donkey, and it's full of crazy adventures and magical realism. Unfortunately, none of his books have survived, but we know that he wrote about a wide range of topics, including ethics, politics, and religion. He was honest, humble, and compassionate. He was also brave. When the Emperor Domitian came into power, he began persecuting the Jews in the empire. Many of them were forced to convert to Christianity, and others were put to death. Apollonius risked his own safety to help the Jews. He visited Jerusalem to see the destruction for himself, and he wrote letters to the emperor asking him to stop the persecution. But Domitian wouldn't listen, and eventually he exiled Apollonius from Rome. Instead, he gave him practical advice, telling him to leave Rome and take a vacation. So Pliny followed his advice, and it seems to have helped. It focused on living in harmony with nature and the universe, and it emphasized the importance of virtue and wisdom. He surrounded himself with beautiful young men, and he spent his time having sex and partying. Apollonius tried to warn him, but Hadrian wouldn't listen. He thought that he was above the rules that applied to ordinary people. Apollonius finally broke off their relationship, and Hadrian became even more depraved. Many of the most famous philosophers in ancient Rome were Stoics, including Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. And Apollonius was one of their greatest teachers. When he was in Rome, he tutored the future Emperor Hadrian. But even though Hadrian adopted Apollonius's philosophy, the two eventually had a falling out. We don't know why, but it might have been because Apollonius criticized Hadrian for not doing enough to stop the persecution of Jews in the Roman Empire. Even though he was a Jew, Apollonius converted to Stoicism, which was a popular philosophy in ancient Rome. We don't have any original writings from Apollonius, but we do have a lot of information about him from other sources, especially from a letter written by the philosopher Pliny the Younger. It's important to note that while Apollonius was a philosopher, he was also a therapist in a sense. That is, he understood the human condition and he knew how to help people deal with their problems. He wasn't just interested in abstract ideas. He wanted to help real people with real problems. This is a theme that runs through all of his work. In another letter, Pliny talks about how he and Apollonius were sailing together in the Mediterranean. Apollonius wasn't just a teacher. He was also a role model. Even though he was in exile, Apollonius continued to teach philosophy. One of Apollonius's most famous students was the Emperor Hadrian. But as Hadrian grew older, he became more interested in pleasure than virtue. Hadrian eventually became the Emperor of Rome, but he was a terrible ruler. He was cruel, capricious, and paranoid. When Hadrian died in 138 CE, his adopted son Antoninus became the new emperor. One of Antoninus's advisors was a former slave named Apuleius. Apuleius wrote a letter to a friend named Lucius, and in that letter he talked about his relationship with Antoninus. This is a great story because it shows how the Stoics believed that everyone could achieve greatness. Another interesting thing about Apuleius is that he was a prolific writer. Apuleius was a master of language, and his writing is both elegant and powerful. Unfortunately, Apuleius's work has been lost for many centuries, but it was rediscovered in the Middle Ages and it quickly became very popular. Today, Apuleius is remembered as one of the greatest writers in Latin literature. But during his lifetime, he was also an influential philosopher and politician. The reason we should study the life of Apollonius is that it teaches us the importance of helping others. When we think of the great philosophers in history, we often think of people like Plato and Aristotle. That's why we should study his life. It reminds us that we should always try to help others and that we should never forget the importance of compassion. If you want to learn more about ancient philosophy, check out the links in the description below. And thanks for watching.